Welcome, everyone. Welcome to University of Phoenix Educational Equity Webinar Series. Thank you for joining us today on this webinar about redlining, getting to the roots. We're so excited to have this conversation and to bring in our speakers today just to learn from their areas of expertise and really expand on our knowledge in these areas. So with that said, welcome, really excited. And if you can move, thank you. Next slide. So my name is Saray Lopez, Director in the Office of Educational Equity. I have the honor of co-hosting this monthly series along with my colleague, Tondra Richardson, fellow director in this office. And the Educational Equity Webinar Series was designed to foster a learning environment where we may explore paths to empower individual action for greater unity and societal transformation. The conversations here are a priority because we serve working adults across all industries, in which 56% of these students identify as members of historically underrepresented communities. Hence, throughout the webinars, we facilitate thought-provoking conversations to promote the practice of inclusive leadership in today's culturally complex society. So next slide, please. Now, today we would like to begin by acknowledging the original inhabitants of all the lands on which we're standing. While we meet virtually, I invite you to join me to honor and give gratitude to the Indigenous peoples who were the original custodians of the various lands we each call home. We recognize that a land acknowledgement alone is not sufficient, yet it does serve as a starting point as we continue our individual journeys towards racial equity. So here in the Phoenix metropolitan area, we inhabit the Hohokam, Akimet-O'odham, Pipash, and Yavapai lands. Thank you for joining us and taking time to honor the original custodians of the lands in which we stand. All right, so we want to make sure we're raising awareness of the significant equity, diversity, and inclusion dates and milestones throughout history. We do know that there may be some dates missing, and definitely invite you to share them in the chat if they're aligned within the month of October. And please include a link where we can learn more about it, maybe articles, resources, anything that we can learn more and we can deepen our understanding of historical events throughout the month of October. Next slide. All right, so we invite you to sign up for our next month's webinar. It's November 17th. I don't know about you all, but thinking of it already being November is just madness to me. But definitely make sure you sign up for our next webinar. We're very excited to have the opportunity to talk about how is it that we can change the narrative in decolonizing the holidays, making sure that we are mindful in our consumerism during this time frame. So please make sure to sign up for it. The link is on the chat. And actually, let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So this conversation today, getting to the roots of redlining. We definitely want to make sure that we're setting the stage for a respectful conversation of fostering learning and being open to potentially uncomfortable discussions. And that only reinforces your willingness to learn and be open-minded for sharing each other's experiences, hearing about the perspectives of others that you may or may not agree with. But I think if anything, this is a safe place where we are here to learn, here to expand our understanding and growth as far as how is it that we can relate to each other? How is it that we can create safer environments within our workplace, within our classrooms, within our communities? So please keep that in mind as you go throughout. And if there's at any point that you feel offended, make sure that there's self-care first, and make sure that you are set up in a way that you feel free to join or step out of conversation. So with that said, let's introduce our speakers today. We are so honored to have with us Dr. Roy Whitmore joining us. He's the author of the book Misled: Hidden Colors of America. He's also a program chair here at University of Phoenix and teaches at DePaul University as well. He owns Whitmore Consulting, committed to developing authentic leaders, ethically sustainable businesses, and long-term strategic alliances with clients. So with over, I believe it was 25 years experience within various areas of leadership and management, vice president of Albertsons, Target stores, we have the opportunity for Dr. Whitmore joining us and really sharing his insight as far as even his own lived experience when it comes to this topic. Now we have Jackie Starks, our dear friend, and we call her now family of University of Phoenix. This is not her first time joining us at a webinar series, and we're just so excited to have her back. A DEI transformation doctor at Jack of all trades. She's a nationally recognized leader in equity, inclusion, mediation, nonviolence practices, and facilitation, committed to inclusive excellence and making a sustainable difference that matters. She has over 16 years of experience at Maricopa Community College District in really helping develop and implement policies, processes, and programs that create a community of DEI engagement and safe spaces, and is the co-founder of Arizona Multicultural Education Conference, as well as co-leads the Healing Racism Collaboration. And both of their bios can go on and on. That can be a webinar in and of itself. But without further ado, let's get into this conversation, and let me hand it over to Jackie.
Thank you, Saray. Hello, everybody. We are so happy to be here this morning, going into the afternoon with this conversation about redlining. I do want to say that as we go through this particular conversation, if you have questions at all for any reason, please put them in the Q&A. Saray or Jaleesa or somebody will look at those and respond. So you don't have to wait until the end for a Q&A. Does that make sense? So at any time, if you have questions, comments, we want this to be as interactive as possible. And they will just come on screen and share your comment or your thought. Okay, so keep that in mind. Dr. Whitmore, I say let's get with it here this morning. Let's get rolling. So what I would like you all to do is get your chat ready. Right? Get your chat ready, because we're going to get you all working here in the chat. So my first question, I want to take you all back to elementary school. I want to take you back to kindergarten and see what you remember. Remember in kindergarten when they taught you about these lights? You all remember that? All right, let's get the chat rolling. In kindergarten, they taught you that green means what? Look at you all go. Yes, yes. Green means go. Good job. Good job. All right. Let's keep rolling. So you got that one. Let's keep moving on in our kindergarten class right here. Also in kindergarten, they taught us about the yellow light. What did they teach you about the yellow? Yellow means, Dr. Whitmore, let me have you share some of the things that they're putting in the chat. What are they putting in the chat?
Yield, slow down. Let me open it up here.
Okay.
Slow down and prepare to stop.
Yeah, slow down, caution, prepare to stop. In some states, they teach you that yellow means go faster, but mostly it's slow down, caution, be prepared to stop. Then we also learned something about the red light in kindergarten. Okay, what are they putting in the chat? Red means?
Stop. Stop, 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 stop.
Red means stop, right? So I start out with those colors to have that conversation with you a little bit, because when we talk about redlining, it is all about colors. not just colors in terms of red, green, yellow, it also goes beyond that to attach color to skin tones, right? So all of that is steeped in this concept of redlining, but I'm also going to later connect that to education for you. All right. So Jinx, we have a poll. I want to do just a couple of other things to get you all warmed up, and we're going to start. Jinx, can you go ahead and launch our first poll? All right, so you have two questions. Number one, do people in the United States live in racially segregated communities? Yes or no? I'd like you to answer that. And then the second one, most people who own property and live in racially segregated neighborhoods do so by choice. True, false, I'm not sure. All right. Love it. Coming in, we're about 94% there. I think we've had everybody respond just about. Excellent. All right, Jinx, do you want to go ahead and launch that? And let's see what they came up with. Or maybe I have to do that because of where it is. All right. So for the most part on the first one, there's most of you said yes, that people live in racially segregated communities. A lot of you said no. And then on the second one, again, most of you said false, that most people who live in these neighborhoods do so by choice. And I love that you all are really up on this, because mostly what we're told about segregation, especially when it comes to housing, we don't look at the impact of redlining, because what we're typically told is that these things happen by choice. And we're also told that we're so diverse that we're no longer racially segregated in how we live and what we do. So I think you all said a little bit differently. But what I want you to do with this, go ahead and we can shut that down. What I want you to think about is where you are right now. And when we get to the end of this presentation, where you are in terms of what you think and what you believe. See if you've moved in any direction either way. So it's not about right or wrong, but where might you sit in either direction. So 3 things that Dr. Whitmore and I want to do. We're going to discuss what redlining is. We're going to look at the impact of redlining then and now, and then just have a conversation about, so what can we do about it? Not only about the impact or the effects of redlining, but this information that we're getting to today. Okay, but what I really want you to understand is that this whole idea of coloring, I started with the lights, it goes beyond basic traffic signals. So let me take you through those lights again to better understand redlining. When we talk about this concept of redlining, which was this way of classifying people based on the color of their skin and putting them in certain places to live and prosper, not within this country. So within that, this legal concept of green was associated to A. So when they set up the laws and they separated the communities, if a community was designated with green, they're A, they're the best. These designated that those communities were all white communities. What we didn't talk about was a blue light, but in these redlining maps, they did have a blue area. The blue areas were still desirable areas. So in those still desirable areas, they were mostly white, probably still all white. But when I say mostly white, there might have been people who were maybe Mexican Americans who under Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo got to be classified as white. So they might have been within these particular green areas. And also within redlining, if we take a look at yellow, when we look at yellow, we're talking about those areas that were graded as a C. A C area was considered an area that was declining. And what declining meant is that white people were moving out. And some of you have probably heard the concept of white flight, correct? So it's like, let's move out of this area, either because they want to designate it as a declining area, or other people are moving into this area that are non-white, non-Caucasian. So it's now considered a C area. Then we get to this concept of red. What does that mean? It stop, just like before, right? Just like in the traffic light, stop, don't go there, hazard. And these areas, they were predominantly Black, people who were Black. There might have been poor people in these particular areas. Other times, you might have seen immigrants in these particular areas right there. But most of, what you're looking at these areas designated as red is that if white people were in these areas, they were trying to move them out or move them on up to a yellow area if they were there, unless they were poor, right? Or in a group not classified as white. So that's some basis for understanding how colors translate within this redlining system, which is extremely important because what you will see is these colors were not just about housing, they impacted many other things. Make sense so far? Right? If you all need me to slow down or stop, or you need to ask a question, don't forget to put it out there. If something, love it, love it. Thank you. Thank you for the thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
Perfect. So let's go to 1938. And I'm just going to use Brooklyn, New York, just to give you an idea of how these things were set up. Keep in mind, these were not things that people created. These were laws that were set up. These were ordinances and codes that were set up to say, this is what we're going to do. So let's look at Brooklyn in 1938. If you take, you can see the green areas. The green areas, again, are those that were most of the white. I've already defined that for you. And I also put numbers because I know that some people can't see colors, that this map might look great for you. So take a look at the numbers. So number 1 is associated with the green areas. Those are the people who were white, who lived in those particular areas. That's where they tended to put funding. So these maps not only said where people were going to live, they decided where infrastructure would exist. These maps decided where funding would go. These maps decided how education and how teachers would be paid within those education systems. They decided where waste dumps were going to go, right? So there was a lot to these maps at that time beyond housing. The blues are marked the number 2. For those of you who are looking at the 2s, those are designated the blue areas that we described. If you look at the number 3, they're designating those yellow caution areas. And then the 4s are some of the red areas. And I did mark all of them. I just marked some of them to just give you a representation, right? So here we have the red areas that are in with number 4. Give you all a minute to take a look at that. So that was 1938, Brooklyn. All right. Now I'm going to move us forward to Brooklyn in 2010. Again, in this particular map, they've designated, it looks at the racial segregation or the racial makeup of Brooklyn. And if you take a look at 1938 and you take a look at 2010, and if you do this for any city, you're going to see that there's some overlap. If you overlay them, you're going to see some consistencies. So to say what was happening in 1938 does not impact what's happening today, it removes an important part of the equation. So we see these segregated neighborhoods like we talked about in that poll that were set up intentionally based on these laws from the 1930s. All right, so keep that in mind. Let me have you take a minute. So for those of you, again, with the colors, I will just say where you see number 1, those are the blue areas where predominantly white people live. The green represents, that's number 2, where you have more Black people in Brooklyn. The red is where we're looking at Asian communities. And again, when we keep in mind, when I say Asian communities, I have to be cautious with that because when we talk Asian communities, it's very different where you might see Asians who identify as Chinese, Chinese American, Japanese, Indian. That's very different from our Southeast Asian communities, which will tend to be more in communities that are designated where you see Blacks, right? So very different. I want to mention that and I recognize that. So not all Asian communities. So you kind of get a look at that. Let me let you all take a look at that. So you see,
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Whitmore, yes.
Yeah, I was just going to add, these maps were created to a great degree by the Federal Housing Administration. They actually wrote it into their bylaws and into their the guidelines they use to approve insurance for loans. So just wanted to make sure that, so our federal government had a hand in creating this type of redlining.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, and I think that's the part, thank you, Dr. Moore, to understand is that not only did they have a hand, they created this because as Dr. Whitmore said, these are laws that were put in place and ordinances. They weren't things that people came up, but that's what they like us to believe. That somebody else came up with this. So thank you so much for sharing. And I do see the comments in the chat. Some of you are, hey, look at your chat because you're being educated in the chat by all of us. We're collective in this learning process. I want, for those of you, just for fun, for those of you who live here in Phoenix, I wanted to share this because what you have, if you look at the colors in Phoenix, is that you have a 1940s map that was created by FHA and others to designate how Phoenix and its surrounding areas would be laid out. So what the ASU Curse Center did is they just overlapped modern day Phoenix to say how this would look today. And again, I don't have the overlay of where we are in 2021, but you're still going to see some consistencies in where people live, and all the things that are going on within those neighborhoods. What I will put in the chat for you, if you all promise not to go right now, what I'm going to put in the chat for you is a link so that later you can go pull up your own city. Don't do it now because you won't pay attention to us, but copy the link, hold on to the link, and then go take a look at your own city. And this won't take you back to 1938 or 1940, but what that link will do is take you to where you are today. Then you can do the research and pull up your city back from the 30s, from the 40s, and do an overlay for yourself to see how things work there. Okay. Moving forward. Okay, I want us to take a look at home ownership in the United States in 2021, because home ownership has so much to do with redlining, and that even if we move forward with other things, is that home ownership is important to take a look at, because home ownership ties to wealth. And wealth is a very big part of redlining. So as I said, it wasn't just about separating whites from blacks and this people from that group. It was about how do we set up structures and systems to create not only wealth, but to create the infrastructures that's going to support these areas that are designated as white and who can own homes. Because if you own a home and you have generational wealth, you're going to be able to better educate your kids, right? So you can put them in private schools where they're given opportunities. Maybe they can do international travel. There are programs that I did not even know about when I was in high school, that I found out when my own kids were in high school, that existed when I was in high school. Because when I was in high school, I lived in those areas that were redlined and yellow lined, as opposed to now I live in the areas that were designated in green. So you find out more things, right? So you have access to information. You have access to prosperity. So again, looking at the consequences of that you don't have in the other areas. So all of this is tied to home ownership. So you could take a look, and I will say that when you're looking at this data from 2021, make sure you look at several different sources. I looked at several different sources. When I looked at like the indigenous population, I saw some sources that said it's less than 1%. Other sources said 55%. So it was varying in many different sources depending on who was putting the information out. This is what I came up with that seemed to be more collective of all the sources that I looked at. So that's important to know, where home ownership is. And the other important thing I want to mention about home ownership, you said, well, home ownership for Blacks, African Americans is 44%. Well, we can come up with a lot of reasons behind that. But what happened is when you were designated in one of those yellow or red areas, a lot of times they would not even give you a mortgage, even within that area, to be able to own property or to be able to put into your business, right? So quite often you weren't even given a mortgage. So it's not that you couldn't buy a home. They were not going to allow you to be able to buy a home. And again, these were rules that were set up based on the laws and statutes at that time. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Jackie, can I just jump in for just a minute? You make a real good point about this redlining was created in order to protect and build wealth for white families, and yet deny that wealth to people of color. And so during the Great Depression, when white families were losing wealth, they were losing their jobs and their mortgages was underwater. That's when the federal government started to build these programs, including the Federal Housing Administration, to support support them to make sure that they maintain and retain their wealth. So, excellent point that you brought up.
All right, thank you. All right, moving on. Again, no question, comments, or thoughts. Again, we invite you all at any time to share. And if there's something is not making sense, just say stop, time out, and let's handle that. All right. Okay. Something else that I want you all to understand about redlining is, if you're familiar with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in that treaty, because again, even with Mexico understanding how people were racially separate and segregated, there was an agreement that Mexicans would be considered white under that treaty. And you know how we are in the United States, our government breaks treaties all the time. Well, in the 30s, Mexicans were declassified as white. So now this left an opportunity for these particular housing laws that we're talking about to now create discrimination. So where you had Mexicans that were in those neighborhoods that were designated as green or designated as blue, you start seeing housing discrimination targeted at them. And the other thing that I can say is that in the United States, you know, you had people bringing claims saying, well, we have these laws, we have the 5th Amendment, we have the 13th Amendment, we have the 14th Amendment. Doesn't that, would that not allow the governments to create these kind of laws? Well, what Congress said in 1883 is those particular amendments do not relate to housing. So it's okay to create laws that discriminate against, right? So this is why in 1930s, you saw the inclusion of Mexicans as being non-white so that they could now be included and excluded within those laws in terms of housing discrimination and other discrimination. Okay, so again, a lot of people miss these particular fine points, and I just wanted to make that point for you. The other thing I often hear is that, well, guess what, Jackie? I live in a racially diverse city. We're so diverse. I live in New York City and you hear this language and that language and you see these people and those people. That's all great and fine and dandy. But what the data shows is that being racially diverse does not equal less segregation. Chew on that for a minute. Having lots of racial diversity does not mean that you're not segregated, which goes back to one of the poll questions that we talked about. And this is a modern day map, or just a brief overview. It's not a full map, but just a racial overview of Washington, D.C., which is one of the most diverse cities. Our capital is extremely diverse, lots of diversity there. But if you take a look again at the colors and numbers, where the black or the blue represent, I mean, the blue and the number 2 represents Black people. If you look at the red and the one that represents where you have the concentration of white people, the yellow or the 4, we're looking at where Hispanics are typically concentrated. The other thing I will tell you about Washington, D.C. is that groups of people who I shouldn't say who identify as Hispanics or Latinx, or who the government has classified in that way, they're really dispersed throughout Washington, D.C., but they tend to be separated where you have Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, you will have Peruvians, you know, so they tend to separate and disperse, but you still see the segregation based on these different classifications within these particular groups. And the green or the number 3 represents where's a concentration of Asians, and very much like the Hispanic or Latinx, you will see that segregation within, whether it's Vietnamese or Hmong or different groups like that. You will also see that within DC. Okay, so again, I think it's extremely important. So if you've been that person having that conversation, but say, oh, I grew up in a school that we were so diverse. My guess is that when you went home, that was probably not the case. And if so, you were probably very backyard people where you still kept to your groups within your backyards and not necessarily the front yards. And that still exists too today. If I were to give you, if you were to say, what are the 3 things that I want to say about redlining? Here are 3 things in short that Dr. Whitmore and I want you all to know: that it was legally sponsored housing discrimination. The roots are in the 1600s, but the main foundation of this legally sponsored housing discrimination happened with the New Deal. How many of you were taught? I know when I was in school and taught about the New Deal, we had to learn a song, a new deal, everybody's gonna get a new deal. Did anybody else learn that song? Well, that New Deal wasn't for everybody, not at all. That New Deal was targeted, as Dr. Whitmore mentioned earlier when he talked about that, it was targeted because you saw that a lot of white families were being harmed through losing jobs and things like that. So how is it that we protect and how is it that we keep that wealth within those communities? It did not apply when you think about Blacks and Latinos who were mostly domestics. They did not benefit from that, and they were still allowed to work long hours and not get paid overtime. So that New Deal was not for everyone. And we also saw that when I talked about redlining, because redlining was a very big part of this right here, and the GI Bill. I hear that again. Well, if you're a part of the GI Bill in the military, it's the same. It was not the same. because Blacks and others, you know, Hispanic people, and even some Japanese through that time who were in the military, who wanted to apply this GI Bill to get housing, they were also denied mortgages or forced to live in certain areas. Dr. Whitmore, go ahead.
Yeah, so when we think about this redlining, and Jackie, you make a good point here, it goes back to the 1600s. So, as slaves during that period, they obviously created wealth for the plantation owners, and they tended to be obviously white, and they were relegated to living in slums. So you fast forward right to the 1930s, when World War II started, and the Great Depression, and wealth was folks were losing their wealth, and you consider at that point African Americans and people of color were still relegated to those areas, and they were being blamed for living in those slum areas and denied wealth. And so, very excellent point. And it was the system, the federal government system was set up to exclude people of color and ensure that, again, that wealth was retained in the hands of white families.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Whitmore. And I was just looking through the chat a little bit where John, and again, there are others, if you see things in there, Dr. Whitmore, that you think we need to bring up, please do, because sometimes I forget to look at the chat. But where, you know, John, you talked about, you know, being in Long Island and looking at the difference between Long Island and the city. Absolutely. And then there was another comment about, oh, Adam's Ruined. How many of you have watched that show? Adam Ruins Everything. If you haven't watched it, I encourage you to, because just bringing things down to looking at the detail and the information and getting to the truth telling is exactly it. So I know it depresses a lot of people who got A's in school and were honor students for, you know, things that they didn't know. And they go, wait a minute, but that's not what I got an A for. Well, you got an A for what they wanted you to know, not necessarily steeped in the truth of what was really happening within our space in our country. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, great show right there. Right.
Jackie, just one point. Great thought on the GI Bill, and you're absolutely right. The GI Bill was supposed to help the soldiers. You know, over 1 million African Americans fought in World War II. In fact, they fought in every war for America. And to your point, they were still denied in 1944 when the GI Bill came out initially. They were denied access to that to that support. Excellent.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, folks. I'm going to share some language with you that's connected to this whole concept of redlining and housing discrimination. And what I want you to do is when I get to, and I'm not going to share all the terms, just a few terms. And when I get to one that you've never heard of, you need to say stop, and Jaleesa or somebody will be watching the chat and say, hey, Jackie, there's a stop right here. We need to talk about that. But I want you to listen to these terms that are really left over from this whole concept of housing discrimination. Let's see, here we go. Single family housing, master bedroom, ghettos, inner city, colored people, credit worthiness, homeowners association, HOAs. And I pause. Did I share anything that you're not familiar with? As I see the chat roll there. No, I didn't think so. And you probably never thought about those concepts as set up in this in redlining and ways to discriminate against groups of people based on their race and to develop wealth. So let me just talk about one of them. I'll talk about single family homes. So let's say you had a Black family who's like, I have the money, I have the means to move into this particular area that's a yellow that's a blue or a green area, right? And they weren't necessarily using those terms. So I want to go live over there, or I want to buy land and buy property over there. But in order to do this, I'm going to go in with my mom. So my mom and I are going to buy this house together. So then, and again, so families would get in and they went, wait a minute, we have to fix that. So then they came up with the concept of single family housing and said, well, you can't live here because only a single family can have a mortgage or live in this space. So if you want to have a home with more than one family on the deed or living together, you need to go to one of those other areas. You probably didn't know that. But again, we're not going to get into history of all of these terms, but they're all steeped within laws and rules that were part of this time. Even think about credit worthiness. At that time, you didn't necessarily have FICO scores, but that FICO score from Fair Isaac Corporation, who did the research on this, actually developed. It was during that time that they were developing a process. And the whole concept of FICO scores was to eliminate bias. But the FICO scores was developed based on the biases that were happening during this time. Does that make sense? So that when they were implemented in 1989, they were still implemented based on these kind of rules that were set up based on who they were seeing as worthy or not, who could pay or not. And they weren't considering race. They weren't considering redlining. They weren't considering areas at that time. So our whole FICO score system that's set up to eliminate bias, and to some degree it works, but there's still wiggle room within that whole thing. Does that make sense? All right.
Jackie, is this a good time to give an example? Or are we running out of time?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so you bring up a good point about redlining, and even today. So when my family moved to the Chicago area, and we were looking around the Naperville area, which is a suburb of Chicago, and I remember the estate agent taking me to places that, from my perspective, at that point was not desirable. And at that point, I was the director of stores for Target, and eventually became the VP of operations for Joel Osco there. But I wanted a place that, when I was into material things, I wanted a place that was on a pond or a lake and near a golf course. And for the longest, the agent refused to show me that type of property. Eventually, I convinced her. Long story short, we bought a house in this neighborhood, and she was not supposed to sell us that house. She was supposed to redline us out. She eventually lost her job. She had a nervous breakdown, and the HOA that you mentioned, Jackie, threatened to sue the real estate company for allowing us to move into the neighborhood. It's incredible. We have the best friends from that neighborhood that we still communicate with even today. So yes, it is real, and it is still real.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. And again, you all pay attention to the chat. There's great things going on there. And somebody said they thought this whole concept of family housing was related to that is something that people came up with later. The concept of single family housing was rooted in racism and discrimination of this particular time, right? And of course, they add other concepts later, but that wasn't the origins of the single family housing at that time. Keep that in mind. And Dr. Whitmore, I was thinking about your story, and I think about others where Black families, what they would often do if they wanted to live in a blue area, especially a blue area, not as much in the green areas, is I've heard stories where they would have a white or a Jewish, typically the person was Jewish, who would buy the home and then resell it to them. And sometimes you would see flight happen in those areas, or those families would be attacked, neighbors would shun them and things like that. So that was a very big part of that as well.
Jackie, I do have a question I think would be really, really appropriate for this.
Yes, go ahead.
It's coming from Tiara Campbell, and she just wants to set a foundation. This topic of diverse versus segregated can be easily seen in major metropolitan cities like Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, where you see different ethnic towns in certain neighborhoods. While I understand that living and conducting business with individuals that look like you can be comforting and familiar, do these towns continue to subjugate the purpose legality of redlining?
Thank you for sharing that. So here's the thing about that. It goes back to one of the poll questions. And, thank you for asking that. That we're saying is that most of the time people are not because it's comfortable. Some groups you do. You see some groups who are saying, I want to be in this affinity space with people like me because in this space, I know that my kids are going to be okay. I'm going to be safe. So that's a part of it. But the bigger part of it is that when I want to go purchase or live in a certain space, and then I'm given a higher interest rate, or, well, you know, over here, we'll give you a lower interest. Over here, you can have low down payments. That happens today. Think about that when they say we're going to give housing subsidies and we're going to help first-time home buyers. Well, depending on where you're first-time home buying, they might eliminate your down payment, but guess where you're going to be based on your race? They don't just say it, but those things still happen today. So that's still a bigger part of the picture than just saying, and there's some. So that's where I'm saying that this segregation is more de jure based on the way the laws have been set up. And we're seeing that now, as opposed to de facto, I'm going to just do it. That happens less than you think, right? Most of the time, these other factors from the 1930s are still playing a part of where we are today. That makes sense. So thank you, Jalise. Thank you for sharing that.
I do have one more question, and you probably will answer it as you get closer to the latter part of your presentation, but what can homeowners, especially those who are looking to purchase a home, do to stand against redlining?
So first, to know what's going on, I think part of it is that really understand and know what's going on in a particular area in terms of where you want to be, know how it's playing out. Remember, is that until the 60s, in 68, it became illegal, right, to do this. So there are other ways that they might try to trap you in that. So recognize what might be happening. And if you feel that this is happening, take time to file complaints. One thing that Maxine Waters is doing, she is trying to strengthen, she's working to try to strengthen certain laws that were put in place to say we can't discriminate and continue to do this today. So yes, there are laws in place, but there's no mechanism for holding lenders and other people accountable. So she's trying to get accountability attached to that. So once you start attaching accountability and say, if you are doing these things as a lender, as a realtor, as a builder, there will be a consequence, because there are not a lot of consequences to them. And I see that. So pay attention, bring it up, ask the questions, file the complaints if you need to, so that people know what's going on. Otherwise, we don't even recognize how it still happened. It's going to be so difficult to recognize. We talk about unconscious or beneath the table. You don't always know that it's happening. So it's a little bit more difficult to pick out.
Jackie, you're right. It's extremely difficult. And so some recommendations that I've really experienced this several times in my life. You got to do the research, right? Make sure that you research whoever your real estate agent is, research the financial institution before you buy, research, the community. And so take a little time, which I did not do back then, and make sure that you understand who you're engaging. Also, to Jackie's point, there's so many subtle ways. Make sure that the interest rate they offer you, make sure that you compare that. Don't accept it blindly. And so again, bottom line, research. And to Jackie's point, file a complaint if you feel like that's happening. But it's still happening even today. When we sold our home in the same home I just told you about, that was redlined, sold it in Chicago just a few years back, mind you. The real estate agents that worked with my wife when she was a real estate agent actually redlined our home to the point that they drove the price down, right? They had a friend buy the house and then they sold it for a huge profit. Now this is redlining hidden, so you can. My wife learned about it because she had friends at the agency.
Yeah. Another way that you see redline hidden is that financial agencies, they love payment shoppers, right? Right. So if you're here, we can get you at this payment. Over there, your payment is going to be that. That's another kind of sneaky way of discrimination that you see. And again, housing, you see it in cars, is that a payment shopper is that, wow, see, as a matter of fact, we could even get your payment down to this if you do this particular thing. So that's another sneaky way that you can see discriminatory practice. And you're going, hey, yeah, that's really cool. I have this payment, and it may not even recognize what's happening to you. Okay. So a lot of wealth is attached to this concept of home ownership, right? And this housing. And we won't have time to discuss this, but just think about this from Stephen mentioned, and he has actually he's a part of the Haas Institute, where they really take a look at how do we truly create a fair and inclusive society. And he says that housing is really at the core of every expression of racial inequality that we have in the United States, then maybe we don't take a look at it. If we had time, we should dig into this a little bit more, but I encourage you, take a picture of this slide and hold on to that. And if you're looking for a follow-up, have a conversation about that and say, what does this mean to me? What does this mean in my city, in my state, in my community, and beyond? Do take a look at that, okay? I do want to show us this clip right here. It's about 4 minutes. As you watch this clip, and maybe you've seen it before, take a look at that and think about how it connects to what we have been talking about, all right? Take a look at that. Pay attention to the dates as well in this particular clip, and then we'll come back afterwards, and I'll see if you all have any comment in the chat or in the Q&A. Right. So this particular clip, as you saw at the end, it was really helping people understand the importance of affirmative action, where that's not what we're here to talk about. I think there's so much more in this. And I saw some of the comments within in the chat. And you could take a look at these different things that were happening and how you're able to really connect them to the concepts of redlining and racial and housing discrimination that ties back to that Stephen Menendian statement that I put in there for you all. So I just wanted to share that. Are there any comments that you all saw in the chat or questions or anything that people had come up related to that? Dr. Whitmore, anything in there that we should pay attention to related to that particular clip?
I see a lot of positive thoughts in here, Jackie. That was powerful. This makes me sick that it's still going on today. I would agree with every segment. That is so sad, but so true. Very well done. Excellent. So yeah.
Great. Thank you. Jaleesa.
Yes, Dr. Whitmore, you had made mention of your experience, and one of our participants wanted to know if your family filed a complaint or took any recourse on some of the things that happened.
That is a very, very good question, and no, we did not, and possibly because at that time, even some years back, I just didn't trust even the judicial system that they would do very much, and we get tied up in court forever. I did talk to a friend of mine that's an attorney, and he said, "Roy, we could be tied up, and it could cost you more than the house. So just best just to leave it alone, unless there's some of the things that Jackie has done. Work with if you work with a larger nonprofit organization or something to try and address some of these issues. But it's so prevalent that it's just difficult to win in court. Even if I don't know that. And I've done a lot of research since you guys invited me to participate in this. I don't know if I've seen any research other than in NAACP actually taking legal action about some of this redlining. Jackie may have seen others, but that's in my research. I found that it just goes unnoticed. And just I'll do one quote from Ben Wiggins, the author of Calculating Race, and he said, "The history of the federal government's role in American apartheid has been largely overlooked and even misunderstood, even by scholars." So no, I did not take legal action. Probably should have, but it would have probably been too costly.
Yeah, you're so right, Dr. Moore. And that's why Maxine Waters is saying we need to start. Okay, so we have an act out there that says you can't do this, but it's not holding the institutions accountable because it is so difficult. And that's why she's saying, okay, we got to go to another step, because time, effort, money, it's like, okay, then it looks like nothing ever happened or discrimination is not taking place. And that's exactly why she's trying to strengthen that act, so that people have to file complaints and take action. There's accountability. So right. There's
yes, you should absolutely file a complaint, take action, get a lawyer, and I've over my lifetime probably could have done that. I don't know, 100 times, but I just chose to stay away from it and fly above it, which is probably not the right thing to do.
It was the right choice for you, for at least for the time. To the points that you all were addressing, how do we get folks of privilege to actually see that this is an issue and bring it to their attention so that something is actually done about it?
So one thing is just how do we, here's a good start right here, because we have 100 and some people here, and really it should be shared by those of you who are in this space, right? Use this space or find your space to educate, to share, to start. And I wouldn't just say, oh, look, Jackie was on as if she's all that. And she knows, do your research so that when you bring it to them, you can say, not only did I hear this in this webinar, here's my research on that. And you have to attach the consequences. And I do want to get to look at some of the consequences. Most of you here, for instance, are like in higher education, right? Or some form of education. So think about when I talked about the light. So you all in education can do something about it, because we grade our students the same way. If you're an A, you're a green student, you're great. If you are a B, You're that blue student, that yellow student, and we accept you. If you're a C student, you're kind of declining. You can go either way. If you're a D student, F student, hazard, maybe we're not paying attention to that, right? So the way we grade is also steeped in this. Think about that. So we're buying to it. In some spaces, it's in academia. We've accepted that as a way of grading our students based on many. So we bought in. So that's something that you all in higher education can deconstruct. So it's not just about what's happening in housing. What's the consequences of that? What happens within spaces of parks? Go take a look at the parks where they're robust and they have lakes versus those that we'll put a broken swing set over here that's maybe not in the shade. Those are things that you can speak up and do, because those are consequences of this redlining that we're talking about. It's not just about the housing, that goes beyond that. So I would encourage you all to look deeper, right? Look deeper at some of the other consequences. And I'll put up some of those. I know we have about 4 minutes. I'm going to run through like a list of some of the things to think about and have us talk more. And what I'm going to ask you all to do, if you can put in the chat again for Jaleesa and Dr. Whitmore to take a look at, what are some things that you can do to deal with some of the consequences of modern day redlining that's happening within the space, right? What are some things that you can do? I'm going to put up the PowerPoint quickly because I want to go through, let me get there, a few things before we end that you might want to see.
Yeah, I would just add, I think, Jackie, you mentioned that education really is the key, and sharing this information with others throughout your community and family. The challenge is that this has become such a commonplace process, this redlining, that folks are bought into it, right? And they believe that it should happen that way. And until we can re-educate the communities, as real estate agents and the people of our communities, it's probably not going to stop.
All right. Or it's going to take that accountability that Maxine Waters is working on. Once you start holding people accountable and financially holding them accountable, then they go, oh, okay, I guess this is important. And that's also a commonplace of what happens with this is people go, yeah, it's important, but it's not truly really important until it financially hits you in the pocket. Then we start to see change, and that's what happens. So I'm going to quickly run through some of the impacts that we see today. This might give you all an opportunity to decide where you want to start, right? So we know that formerly redlined areas are mostly non-white. The green areas are mostly white. That's one thing to think about where they are. But also in those areas, not only do we see the segregation, but we see that there's little public investment in those formerly redlined areas. So go to your city council meetings, pay attention to the zoning. And if there's an area that could be used as maybe a space to place a garden to help with food in a certain area where there are food deserts, maybe you want to go to your city and say, we don't want to make this apartments. Think about where apartments are going up all over the place. So that's something that you can do. Pay attention to what's going on in your city council areas. A few other things to think about is that in those redline areas, of course, you're still going to see more poverty. There's still poverty. There's still subprime lending within those spaces. There's health disparities. So if you work in programs that are healthcare focused, think about how that applies to these formerly redline or green line areas where there are better health conditions. So you can impact things within that way. Those are things that are still happening today, right? Education systems, I've mentioned that already. So in education systems, you see those typically redline areas, you're going to see that more Black women have higher debt that contributes to this $1.74 trillion debt because they don't have the wealth. And so there's a difference between income. You might say, oh, I have a Vietnamese neighbor and they're making $500,000, but they probably don't have the historical wealth that if they lost that salary, they would probably be greatly impacted by that. All right. So some things to keep in mind and places that you might want to start and roll with that. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I know we're about at the end. Thank you all so much. I'm going to turn it over to Saray for last minute conversations. We get y'all out of it.
Thank you, everyone. It's been
Thank
fun.
you so much to both of you, Dr. Whitmore, Jackie. This was so informative. And I feel like I have so much homework now to go and look at all the resources that were shared within the chat. We will be sharing the recording as well as the chat script. So you can all go back and do all the learning that we need to. I think that is one of the key ways that we can start dismantling the systemic inequities, is educating ourselves and becoming aware of what we're surrounded with and in the positions that we stand. So thank you to both of you. And we look forward to seeing you next month on November 17th to join our webinar on changing the narrative, decolonizing the holidays. Thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, University of Phoenix, my family. Enjoyed. Thank you, Saray, Tandra, Jaleesa, Dr. Whitmore. Pleasure. Look forward to working with you again.
Thank you, Jackie. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. Saray, appreciate it.